The restaurant had a way of carrying secrets in the quiet between its walls. By day, it was all chatter, clinking glasses, and the soft shuffle of polished shoes across the floor. But by night, when the last tables were cleared, and only a handful of staff remained, the place seemed to hold its breath. Shadows stretched longer, the smell of wine lingered in the air, and the silence pressed close, like it knew what was about to happen. That night had started like any other, or at least it seemed that way at first glance. The city outside was buzzing with the usual noise of expensive cars rolling past, lights flashing from tall glass buildings, and people in tailored clothes rushing into places they believed mattered. The restaurant sat tucked at the corner of a busy downtown street, its glowing name in gold letters meant to catch the attention of people who could afford to walk in without looking at the menu prices. Inside, the room was alive with murmurs of deals being whispered across tables, laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes, and the kind of smiles that cost more than they gave. In one corner of the room, the billionaire sat. He didn't need to say much, his presence alone bent the atmosphere around him. He was the kind of man people noticed, not because of charm, but because power carried its own kind of gravity. His watch was the kind of thing people would talk about for weeks. His suit, cut to perfection. Every detail designed to remind the world that he had won. And yet, behind the easy confidence and calm expression, there was something unsettled, something quietly restless. He had climbed higher than most could ever dream, but the higher a man goes, the thinner the air becomes, and the lonelier. Not far from him, weaving through tables with the grace that comes from years of practice, was the waitress. She wasn't dressed in anything that would stand out. Her uniform was simple, black and pressed, but her eyes caught more than they were meant to. She had been working in the restaurant long enough to know the difference between casual conversation and a deal that could shift entire fortunes. She also knew how often the line between wealth and destruction was thinner than people believed. She watched the way people leaned in close, the way papers slid across tables, the way promises were made with a smile that hid a blade. And on this night, she noticed the billionaire more than anyone else. The deal in front of him looked like nothing unusual to anyone watching. A folder on the table, a pen laid neatly across the top, and two men waiting with polite but expectant faces. They were dressed in the kind of grey suits that seemed to blend into the walls, but their eyes stayed sharp, their patience heavy. They weren't used to waiting, and the billionaire knew that. What he was about to sign wasn't just another document, it was something bigger, something dangerous, though few in the room could see it for what it was. The waitress felt it first. It was more than intuition. It was the way the room seemed to shift, how the air grew heavier, how the billionaire's hand hesitated just a second too long above the pen. She had seen men destroyed in ways that left no blood, only silence. She had seen how contracts could bind tighter than chains, how choices made in the glow of power could lead to ruin in the cold light of morning. The others in the room didn't notice the tension, not yet. To them, it was just another night, another deal being signed in the corner. Laughter bubbled up from another table, glasses clinked, and someone called out for another bottle of champagne. But at that very moment, something fragile had cracked, something that couldn't be glued back together once broken. The billionaire, the waitress, and the men in the grey suits weren't strangers to one another, though none of them would have admitted the truth. Their lives had already brushed against each other in ways that weren't yet clear, like threads pulled tight in the dark. Each of them carried a past, scars, secrets, and choices they tried to bury. But on this night, those buried truths had begun to stir. The billionaire thought he was in control, as he always did. To him, this was just another move in a long game he had been winning for years. But control has a way of slipping through fingers the moment you believe it's unshakable. The men across from him believed they held the upper hand, that their papers and their promises would bind him. But greed has its own sharp teeth, and those who bite too hard often bleed. And the waitress, she had no place in their world, Not really. She didn't belong at the table, didn't belong in the decisions being made. But sometimes, the people on the outside see things that the ones in power cannot. Sometimes, the warning doesn't come from the men in suits, or the lawyers, or the partners. It comes from someone no one bothers to hear until it's too late. That night, as the billionaire reached for the pen, the waitress moved closer. The words that would leave her mouth in the next few seconds would change the room forever. She wasn't just serving drinks anymore. She was about to step into a storm none of them could escape. The restaurant was still alive with the hum of normal life, but beneath it, something else had begun to breathe. A warning, a fracture, the sound of fate sharpening its edge. And in the middle of it all, a single voice was about to break the illusion, pulling the mask off a moment everyone thought was safe. The warning hadn't been spoken yet, but the weight of it was already pressing against the air. It was the kind of night that would be remembered, not for the food, not for the wine, but for the words that stopped a billionaire's hand in its tracks and left an entire room stunned. The pen rested between the billionaire's fingers, a thin line of ink waiting to spill across the page. Yet his hesitation stretched longer than expected. The two men in grey suits shifted, exchanging glances that were too sharp to be casual. Their patience wore thin, though their smiles stayed fixed. The billionaire had seen those kinds of smiles before. He knew they meant nothing good. It was a performance, the sort of mask men wore when they believed the deal was already theirs. The waitress lingered nearby, not by chance. She carried a tray, pretending to polish the rim of a glass, though her eyes kept returning to the table in the corner. Something gnawed at her. Something she couldn't shake. She had heard pieces of conversations, enough to know the document on the table wasn't just another business deal. It was bait, and he was seconds away from swallowing it whole. When she leaned in and said, "Don't sign that," the room seemed to snap. The words weren't loud, but they cut clean through the noise, sharp enough to freeze the billionaire mid-motion. A small laugh rose from one of the suited men, a sound too smooth to be genuine. The other tightened his jaw. For a moment no one spoke, the clinking glasses and polite laughter from across the room feeling like a different world altogether. The billionaire turned to her, his face unreadable. He wasn't used to being interrupted, much less warned by someone who was supposed to be invisible in his world. His eyes narrowed just slightly, but beneath the calm there was a flicker, curiosity, maybe even unease. He asked her quietly, "What did you say?" Her hands trembled, but she didn't back down. "Don't sign it," she repeated, firmer this time. The tray she carried pressed against her stomach as if to steady her. The words seemed reckless, almost foolish, but they carried a weight that even the billionaire couldn't dismiss. The men in grey shifted again, but this time their polished exteriors cracked. One leaned forward, his voice low, controlled, but edged with threat. "She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's staff. This isn't her concern." But it was her concern, because she had seen the same men before. Months ago, sitting at another table, papers spread wide, another man smiling too easily as he signed. She remembered the whispers weeks later, the hushed tone of regulars who said he had lost everything, that his empire collapsed in weeks, his family vanishing into the kind of silence no one dares question. That memory burned at her now. The billionaire's eyes flickered between the waitress and the men across from him. His heartbeat quickened, though he hid it well. He prided himself on control, on reading people, on knowing when he was being played. But in this moment, the ground beneath him shifted. Why did this stranger care enough to speak? What did she know? The waitress's warning planted doubt, and once doubt takes root, it grows fast. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together, buying time. "Tell me," he said softly to her. "Why shouldn't I?" Her throat tightened. She wasn't supposed to be part of this world, but here she was. her voice caught in a storm she couldn't walk away from. "Because it's not what you think. It's not a deal. It's a trap. I've seen it before." Her words were shaky, but true. The grey-suited men shifted from polite to menacing. Their gazes hardened, their smiles slipped. "Enough!" one of them snapped, his voice sharp enough to draw the attention of a nearby table. A few curious eyes turned toward them, but quickly turned away. No one wanted to get involved in the business of powerful men. The billionaire raised his hand, silencing the tension for a brief moment. He studied the waitress, searching her face for deception, then turned back to the men. "If it's as good as you say," he murmured, "then you won't mind me taking more time." That was the first crack, the first push against the men's carefully built performance. And once that crack appeared, everything began to unravel. Over the following nights, things grew darker. The waitress found herself under the weight of attention she didn't want. Strangers lingered at the edges of her shift, watching her too closely. Calls came through the restaurant phone asking for her by name. Her manager frowned, warning her to stay out of things she didn't understand. But she couldn't. Not anymore. The billionaire, too, began to feel the walls close in. For all his wealth and power, paranoia began to eat at him. Deals he had counted on began to falter. Old enemies reappeared, circling like vultures. He started questioning the loyalty of those around him. His advisors, his so-called friends, even his family. The waitress's warning had planted more than doubt. It had exposed the cracks already growing inside him. But there was something else, something unspoken, between the billionaire and the waitress now. Their worlds should never have collided, but they had. Late one night, after the restaurant closed, he approached her quietly, away from the others. His tone was softer than before, but his words carried weight. "What do you know?" Her answer was hesitant but steady. "Enough to see where it leads." He pressed, demanded, tried to pull the truth from her, but the more he asked, the more she withdrew. She wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting him, and that unsettled him more than any threat from the men in grey. The days that followed built pressure like a tightening rope. The men returned, their politeness stripped bare. They pressed harder, leaning into threats masked as promises. At the same time, whispers began to spread about the billionaire's empire, rumors of lawsuits, investigations, betrayals inside his own circle. His foundation was shaking, and everyone knew it. The waitress carried her own weight too. She lived in a cramped apartment far from the glittering towers downtown, a place where the ceiling leaked when it rained, and sirens passed by more often than silence. She had her own past, her own secrets, things she had run from, things she never told anyone. But when she warned the billionaire, part of her wasn't just protecting him. She was protecting herself too. She had seen what happened when powerful men signed deals with devils in grey suits. She had seen it destroy lives. She refused to watch it happen again. Tension grew with every passing night. The billionaire's confidence thinned, his once calm exterior cracking under pressure. He lashed out at those closest to him, questioning loyalty, suspecting betrayal where there was none. The men in grey tightened their grip, circling like predators, certain their prize was slipping away. And the waitress, she found herself caught in something far larger than she ever imagined. She began to notice shadows following her on her walk home, footsteps echoing too close behind. At work, her manager warned her again. "Don't involve yourself with them. They don't forgive." But it was too late. She was already involved. The night it all broke open, the restaurant was louder than usual, filled with laughter that felt forced, a little too sharp. The billionaire sat at his table again, the folder back in front of him, the pen laid neatly across. The men in grey sat across from him, but their patience was gone, their faces set hard. The waitress moved carefully through the room, her heart pounding. She knew what was about to happen. Everyone in that room thought they were watching a simple deal, another night of business. But beneath it, something darker pulsed, growing closer to eruption. The billionaire reached for the pen again. The waitress's breath caught in her throat, and as his fingers closed around it, she knew this was the moment, the point of no return. Would he listen to her again, or would he choose the path that would pull them all into the storm? The air in the room thickened, charged with something unspoken. Every eye turned toward the table, though no one admitted they were watching. And in that moment, the fragile world they all clung to teetered on the edge of collapse, one signature away from shattering. The restaurant glowed in soft golden light that evening, every polished surface gleaming as though it had been prepared for something far grander than dinner. The hum of voices mixed with the low music drifting through the air, but beneath it there was a current of unease. The billionaire sat once more at his usual corner table, though this time his calm was frayed. His jaw was tight, his fingers restless against the edge of his glass. Across from him, the two men in grey suits leaned in close, their words softer than the clinking of silverware, yet sharp enough to slice through the noise around them. The waitress felt it in her chest the moment she walked into the room. The air was heavier, colder, as though the night itself had shifted. She had seen the folder appear again on the table, the pen resting like a loaded weapon. But tonight was different. There was no patience left in the men's smiles, no effort to mask the menace in their eyes. The deal was no longer about persuasion, it was demand. She moved between tables, her hands trembling around the tray, her ears tuned to the words drifting from the corner. "You've delayed long enough," one of the men said. His voice was low, but the anger in it pulsed. "You sign tonight. We're done waiting." The billionaire met his stare, and for a brief second, it was as though two predators circled, neither willing to back down. "I don't sign anything under pressure," he replied. But the truth was, pressure was breaking him. The past weeks had left him raw, rumours of collapse, allies pulling away, whispers of betrayal within his empire. He wasn't the unshakable figure he once was. The waitress edged closer, her instincts screaming. Her throat was dry, but she knew she couldn't stay silent again. She leaned in, voice trembling but firm. "Don't do it. Not tonight. Please." The words drew the eyes of everyone at the table. The billionaire's heart pounded, torn between pride and the gnawing fear that she was right. For a second his hand hovered over the pen, hesitation locking him in place. And that's when it happened. One of the men in grey, his patience gone, reached across the table. His hand landed not on the pen, but on the billionaire's wrist, gripping hard. It was a gesture meant to control, but it sparked something else entirely. The billionaire snapped, his other hand shooting up to shove him back. The chair scraped sharply against the floor, the sound cutting through the chatter of the room. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. The second man stood abruptly, his face dark with fury. The waitress dropped her tray, glass shattering at her feet, the sound ringing out like a gunshot. The restaurant froze, every eye on the corner. The billionaire pushed himself up from his chair, his chest heaving. "You think you can force me?" he spat. His voice cracked with rage and fear, louder than he intended. The man closest to him leaned forward, his whisper low but venomous. "You don't understand what you're playing with." His hand slid beneath his jacket in a motion so smooth it almost went unnoticed. Almost. But the waitress saw it, her stomach dropping as the glint of metal caught the light. "No!" she cried, but her voice was drowned in the chaos that erupted. The first shot split the air, deafening in the enclosed room. A glass shattered on a nearby table, and people screamed as they ducked. The billionaire staggered back, his face frozen in disbelief. Blood bloomed across the front of his tailored shirt, spreading too fast to be ignored. The room exploded into panic. Chairs toppled, plates crashed, guests scrambled toward the exits, their screams blending into a single roar of terror. The billionaire fell against the edge of the table, knocking the folder to the floor, the papers scattering like dead leaves. The waitress rushed forward without thinking. Her hands pressed against his wound, warm blood flooding between her fingers. His eyes locked on hers, wide with shock, mouth opening as though to speak, but only a ragged breath escaping. The men in grey didn't flee. They stood still, their faces cold, their calm terrifying amid the chaos. One lowered the gun, sliding it back beneath his jacket as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The other picked up the fallen folder, straightening the papers with a precision that felt cruelly deliberate. "You should have signed," he muttered, the billionaire. His breaths came shorter, his strength slipping. His mind raced in fragments. Memories of his rise, the faces of those he'd stepped over, the family he had kept at a distance. Regret flickered in his eyes, sharp and sudden, as if the truth of his life revealed itself only in his final moments. The waitress's tears blurred her vision, her voice desperate. "Stay with me. Don't close your eyes. Please." She wasn't thinking of his power, his wealth, or even the danger she'd put herself in. She thought only of the man before her, the fragile human being crumbling in her arms. The restaurant staff scrambled, some shouting for an ambulance, others herding terrified guests out the door. But the seconds stretched unbearably, each one louder than the last. The billionaire tried to speak, his lips forming words she couldn't quite hear. She leaned closer, her ear almost against his mouth. "Don't let them—" His voice broke off, his body convulsing once, then stilling. Silence fell heavy in her chest. She shook her head, pressing harder, but the truth was undeniable. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, had gone dim. The men in grey exchanged a glance, calm in a way that chilled her to the bone. One whispered, "It's done," and they turned, walking toward the exit as though the chaos belonged to someone else. No rush, no fear, just cold certainty. The waitress's hands were soaked red, her uniform ruined, her heart pounding so violently it hurt. Around her, the room was a storm of screaming, weeping, and running feet, but she sat frozen beside his body. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind spiraling between disbelief and rage. The crime had unfolded in seconds, but its weight settled like stone. The billionaire's empire, his power, his pride, all of it ended not in boardrooms or headlines, but in blood on a restaurant floor. And she knew, as her hands shook against his still chest, that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The immediate aftermath was chaos, but beneath it ran something darker: denial, disbelief, the desperate attempt to make sense of what had just shattered their world. Some staff tried to claim it was a robbery gone wrong. Others whispered that it was a message, punishment for debts unpaid. But the waitress knew the truth. It wasn't just a crime. It was a warning. And she, the one who had spoken too late, was now tangled in it forever. The restaurant never felt the same after that night. Even after the police cleared the scene, after the lights dimmed and the chaos gave way to silence, the air seemed permanently stained. Staff returned the next day, moving quietly, their eyes darting toward the corner where blood had pooled and dried on the polished floor. Some refused to step near it, and others whispered about quitting altogether. No one could shake the image of the billionaire collapsing, his life slipping away in front of everyone. The waitress sat alone in her small apartment, her hands still raw from scrubbing, though the smell of iron clung to her skin. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the flicker of regret in his eyes, the last broken words caught in his throat. She replayed her warning again and again, asking herself if she should have screamed louder, if she should have done more. Guilt wrapped around her like a weight she couldn't put down. She was just a waitress, yet somehow she had stepped into a storm that destroyed everything. The billionaire's death shook the city. He hadn't just been a man, he had been an institution. His wealth, touched businesses, charities, and politicians. Newspapers printed his photo across their front pages, calling him everything from a visionary to a ruthless opportunist. His empire was dissected overnight, investors panicking, competitors circling like sharks. But more than that, his name became the center of whispered conversations about the deals he made, the enemies he collected, the cracks in his carefully built image. His family was thrown into the spotlight instantly. A wife who had lived in the shadow of his power now stood before cameras, her face pale, her voice trembling as she asked for privacy. Children who had only ever been glimpsed in glossy magazines were suddenly hunted by reporters, each headline digging for scandal. The image of control he had crafted in life unraveled quickly in death. People began to question how much he had really built and how much had been borrowed, stolen, or manipulated. The men in grey disappeared. Witnesses remembered their faces, their cold stares, the gun that had been drawn. But by the time the police chased the trail, it was gone cold. It was as if they had never existed, leaving behind only fear. Authorities interviewed staff, diners, and anyone who had been present that night. The waitress was questioned again and again, each time reliving the moment she shouted, "Don't sign it!" and the way his blood had soaked through her hands. Detectives pressed her for details, but she had little to give them. She wasn't part of their world. She had only brushed against it. For her, the psychological toll grew heavier with each passing day. At night, she heard footsteps outside her door. She jumped at every knock, every shadow. She stopped walking home the same way, always circling blocks, certain someone was following. Whether it was paranoia or truth, she couldn't tell anymore. But she knew deep down, the men in grey hadn't forgotten her. She had interfered, and they would never forgive that. Public opinion shifted wildly in the weeks that followed. Some painted the billionaire as a victim of jealousy and greed, cut down in his prime by enemies who couldn't match his success. Others saw his death as inevitable, the price of years of corruption, arrogance, and backroom deals finally catching up to him. Strangers gathered outside his skyscraper headquarters, some leaving flowers, others holding signs demanding investigations into his dealings. In death, he became both martyr and villain. The waitress found herself caught in the middle of it all. Journalists tracked her down, desperate for her story. Some offered money, others threatened exposure if she stayed silent. Her name leaked, whispered in blogs and tabloids as the unknown waitress who warned him. Overnight, she became a symbol, praised by some for bravery, condemned by others as complicit. She didn't want any of it. She wanted her life back, the quiet rhythm of serving tables and going home unnoticed. But that was gone. Meanwhile, inside the billionaire's inner circle, fractures grew. Advisors turned on one another, each scrambling to distance themselves from the deal that had led to his death. Some claimed they had warned him, others swore they had no knowledge. His closest allies struggled to keep the empire afloat, but every move was shadowed by suspicion. The truth was, his empire had always been built on shaky ground, and now the foundation had collapsed. The emotional fallout for those closest to him ran deeper than the headlines could capture. His wife retreated from public view, her grief heavy with more than loss. She had known pieces of the man few ever saw, the paranoia, the late-night calls, the shadows that followed him. Part of her had always feared something like this would happen. His children carried anger more than sorrow, angry at the men who killed him, but also at the father who had dragged them into a life where violence followed at every step. For the waitress, the grief and guilt bled into everything. She found herself staring at empty tables during her shifts, her mind slipping back to that night. She kept hearing his voice, that broken whisper, "Don't let them." She didn't know what he meant, but she carried it like a curse. It haunted her, unfinished, a warning she couldn't decipher. The community struggled too. The restaurant lost its charm, once a place of luxury and deals, now a symbol of tragedy. Regulars stopped coming. Tourists came instead,
pointing at the corner where he had died, lowering their voices like they were visiting a grave. Staff walked out, unable to bear the memories. The place became a shell of itself, haunted not by ghosts, but by the weight of a crime that had touched everyone who had been there that night. Legal investigations dragged on, but little came of them. The billionaire's lawyers spun narratives, the media spun others, and in the middle of it all, the truth blurred. The men in grey remained shadows. Some said they worked for foreign investors, others claimed they were tied to organised crime. No one could prove anything. The case became another unsolved chapter in the city's history, whispered about but never resolved. The waitress carried the deepest scars. Every day she wrestled with the question of whether she could have saved him. Every day she wondered if his death had been her fault, if speaking had sealed his fate instead of saving him. And every day she lived with the reality that his blood had once stained her hands, and nothing would ever wash it away. The aftermath wasn't just grief and fear. It was a ripple that spread wide, across his family, his empire, the city, and the life of a waitress who had tried to do the right thing. The crime had ended his life, but it had destroyed countless others in quieter, slower ways. And as the weeks passed, one truth grew painfully clear. Power and wealth might have built his world, but in the end, it could not protect him from the same fragility that binds them all. The weeks turned into months, but the shadow of that night never left the city. The billionaire's death remained both a headline and a whisper, a story retold in bars, in offices, in living rooms where people debated what really happened and who was to blame. Yet for all the noise, the truth stayed buried. The men in grey were never caught, the gun was never recovered, and the deal that had been at the centre of it all was swept into silence as though it had never existed. For the billionaire's family, life fractured beyond repair. His wife withdrew completely, moving out of the mansion that once stood as a monument to their wealth. To the public, she was a grieving widow, but behind closed doors, whispers said her grief was laced with resentment. She had lived years under his shadow, his control, and the endless battles his ambition created. Now, she was left with wealth, but no peace. Her name tied forever to his downfall. His children inherited more than money. They inherited his enemies, his unfinished battles, and the heavy truth that their father's choices had paved to. He way to his violent end. The billionaire's empire crumbled piece by piece. Lawsuits piled up, investigations opened into his past business dealings, and people once loyal to him scattered to protect themselves. In the boardrooms where his name once commanded silence, his reputation was dismantled. Deals that had seemed unshakable dissolved overnight. He had built a kingdom on power and intimidation, but without him, it collapsed into dust. The waitress's life changed in ways she could never have imagined. She became known not by her name, but by her warning. The waitress who said, "Don't sign that." Strangers treated her like a symbol, reporters hounded her, and customers came to the restaurant just to catch a glimpse of her. Some saw her as brave, others accused her of being part of it all. But for her, the reality was quieter and far heavier. She didn't feel brave. She felt haunted. She carried guilt that gnawed at her every day. Guilt that maybe she had done too little, too late. Police questioned her repeatedly, but in the end she wasn't charged. She wasn't a suspect, only a witness. Yet she knew deep down that her life had been marked. The men in grey had seen her interfere, and though they had walked out calm and unhurried, she could never shake the feeling that their eyes had left something behind, a promise that she was not forgotten. Was justice served? On the surface, no. The men who pulled the trigger vanished. The billionaire's death was written into files as an unsolved case, another story where money and influence clouded the truth. But justice, in its rawest form, sometimes comes differently. For all his wealth, the billionaire couldn't escape the consequences of the life he had built. His greed, his arrogance, his endless hunger for control,
All of it led him to that moment in the restaurant. In a way, he was destroyed not just by the men in grey, but by the very choices he had made long before that night. The city felt the weight of it too. His death became a symbol of the dangers hidden beneath power. People questioned how far wealth could reach, how many hands it touched, and how quickly it could all turn to ash. Politicians who had once smiled beside him scrambled to distance themselves. Laws were discussed, tighter regulations on corporate deals, closer scrutiny on financial partnerships, but like most things they faded with time, buried under new scandals and tragedies. Still for a while, the crime forced people to look at the cracks in the world of wealth and power, cracks most preferred to ignore. For the waitress, the aftermath became her own kind of prison. She stopped working at the restaurant. The memories were too heavy, the questions from strangers too invasive. She moved quietly, taking shifts elsewhere under different names. But no matter where she went, she couldn't escape the moment that had defined her life. She carried his last words like a weight on her chest. "Don't let them." The sentence unfinished, the meaning unknown. It became a riddle she couldn't solve, a message she felt responsible for. And yet, in that burden, something shifted inside her. She realized she had seen the truth of power, the way it corrupts, the way it destroys, the way it consumes even those who believe they control it. She had stepped into a world she never belonged to, but in doing so, she saw its rotten core. That knowledge changed her. She no longer looked at wealth as something to be admired, but as something dangerous, sharp enough to cut through anyone who came too close. The story of the billionaire and the waitress became something more than just a crime. It became a mirror. People looked at it and saw their own fears, their own anger at systems built on greed and manipulation. They debated morality. Was the billionaire a victim, or had he created his own fate? They debated power. How much is too much, and who pays the price when ambition goes too far? In the end, the story left more questions than answers. Justice wasn't neat. Lives weren't healed. The community didn't move on untouched. Instead, they carried the story with them as a warning, a reminder that behind the polished glass of power lies a fragile, dangerous truth. The billionaire lost everything. His family inherited grief instead of a legacy. His empire dissolved into lawsuits and dust. The men in grey remained shadows, proof that power often hides behind faces that never see justice. And the waitress, she walked away with nothing but memories, scars, and the burden of knowing she had tried to stop it, yet failed. What the story revealed more than anything was the complexity of human behavior. Ambition, greed, fear, guilt, regret. They all played their part. The billionaire's downfall wasn't caused by a single bullet, but by years of choices that made that bullet inevitable. The men in grey weren't just killers. They were symbols of the darker forces that thrive in silence. And the waitress wasn't just a bystander. She was proof that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truths, even if no one listens until it's too late. When all the dust settled, the crime remained unsolved in the eyes of the law. But in the eyes of those who watched it unfold, the truth was clear. Power without morality destroys everything it touches. And sometimes justice doesn't come in courtrooms or prisons. It comes in the quiet collapse of an empire, in the regret of a dying man, in the warning that lingers long after the last word is spoken. The city moved forward, as cities always do, but the story lingered. The golden corner of the restaurant stayed empty, a place no one wanted to sit. People still lowered their voices when they spoke of him, as though his ghost was listening. And for the waitress, the story never ended. She carried it with her everywhere, a reminder of how fragile life is, how quickly power crumbles, and how sometimes a warning comes too late to save anyone at all.